I'm going to share a little bit about a project I've been working on, or helping with actually, the last year and a half. It's called the IoT Security Testing Guide. Take you through a little bit of a journey. So a little bit about me. So Mark shared some of the work, with Cloud Security Alliance, and helped lead the OWASP IoT project as well. And some other fun things, had the opportunity to technical review a number of books, both with Packet Publishing and No Starch. And so actually reviewing one right now, a new one that's not yet on the screen, but they're always good to kind of IoT is such a broad space. It's pretty much the whole stack, right? And so, lucky enough to at least share some of my perspective and expertise and help shape these books as well. So I'm currently with Cisco Meraki. We help, lead a number of teams that secure basically our IoT products end to end, from hardware, firmware to front end, back end, API, mobile. With our product application security teams, offensive security, and PCERT. So they all contribute to, trustworthiness of our product, right? And if you're familiar with Cisco Meraki, if you even go maybe next door to Walmart, you'll see some of our devices powering up, or even if you're staying at a hotel, they're usually powering up the Wi-Fi's there. So massive impact around the world, and super lucky to have the opportunity to help secure those products, right? And my teams are doing a wonderful job. One of my team leaders is here. Outside of that, OWASP LA used to be a big, board member there, but also the AppSec Cali conference. They now shifted that over to another sort of event similar to, LASCON has theirs for Austin and Texas, and so LA and California, actually, all the chapters used to get together and have a conference in January, and sort of just celebrate some of the work, and you're also on the beach. So again, those are still going, just a different name. But we'll go ahead and get going. So I'm curious, just to start off with, familiarity with testing guides. So anyone familiar with maybe the mobile testing guide and web testing guide? Yeah, show of hands. Okay, just about a handful, or half, I would say. How many folks are pen testers or have pen tested IoT before? Okay, yeah. Any challenges that anyone's willing to share in terms of some of the, when you're testing IoT, what sort of things that do you come across? Again, kind of the landscape's wide, right? And if you're new, it might be a little bit overwhelming, right? You don't know where to start. You might be maybe focused on web, as a maybe software security engineer, or just a software engineer, or mobile. And maybe that might be the first place you start with, and maybe make your way down the stack, right? In some ways, I know that's the sort of route that I went, because at the end of the day, right, everything is code, from hardware, to the firmware and the wireless protocols and all those fun things, right? So they're similar concepts, right? There's no reinventing the wheel. It's just a different perspective and approach. And so, what are some ways you can gain some confidence with some of the security testing? Anyone have sort of ideas, like if you're on the other end of receiving like a penetration test, what's the typical sort of outcomes that you receive? There's like a deliverable, right? And what's that deliverable? Well, it's usually like a report, right? A PDF report, a Word doc report, and it might not be something you can, build into your lifecycle processes from your security teams or development, right? Maybe it's just a point in time. It's not machine readable. There's no JSON, YAML, or anything for you to even reproduce, right, within your environment. It's just maybe a checkbox sometimes, or hey, I want to test this product or this device, and I get these critical flaws and highs, and remediate them, and you move on. But again, it's not repeatable. You also probably don't even know how they tested it. Maybe they have their boilerplate OWASP web testing guide or mobile testing guide, or their maybe their own product security assessment methodology that they built, right? And there isn't anything that you can really grasp from that, unless they're sort of citing the specifics of what test cases, right? And this is sort of what we're trying to aim to maybe like demystify, so to speak. Because, right, like if you can't, at least from my perspective, from a manufacturing perspective, I want to be able to retest some of those particular cases in the future. I don't want to start from square zero. I don't want to, impact the business in that way in terms of cycles. So I'm always striving for repeatability, interoperability, and the best way you can do that, right, is with transparency of what those test cases are. And so, testing guides help with those, right? Whether it's mobile, web, and just to kind of get a little bit of, some of the background and the origin of how this project came about, right? Talking about transparency and repeatability a lot. The project leader, Luca, he's actually based out in Europe, in Germany. He approached me with a gap in sort of what we have for IoT. He's like, hey, Aaron, thank you for some of the publications you're working on. I did a master thesis on IoT testing guide. I think it'll help the industry. I don't know how to move forward with that with OWASP. Is that something you can help with? And I'm like, sure, yes, I'll do my best to help. And let me see what I can do. He's like, we have the firmware security testing guide that you put out some years ago, but it's very particular. It's not, it's very particular to firmware. It's something you could use if you're new to firmware and you don't know how to hack firmware or assess a firmware image. But we want something more broad in terms of how you really set your perspective and your access, whether it's your physical access to a device, and that will help you tailor your test cases, or whatever your authorization or credential access to that device is. And that's what's different from the IoT side, right? You have more of a device in hand, or maybe you have a device that could be, can be hung up on a wall. And so, we went ahead and okay, web security testing guide, mobile security testing guide. Let's fill this gap. Let's fill this need here. But first, again, some of the problems that he laid out to me. I mentioned some of the incomplete guides with firmware, and there's a lot of other penetration testing guides, like bullet points. There's no taxonomy in terms of the categories and how to really get going, right? But also the reproducibility of those tests. Again, sort of harping on that, I think that's a big aspect, right? How do I ensure these procedures are done in a way that I can understand them, or my team can understand them, or my engineers, or even if I'm going to maybe a testing lab to get a device certified for some particular framework, as an example. And so he developed this methodology you see to the right on the solutions to build these models. It's an attacker model and also it's a model that's comprehensive. Then it gives you just the device itself, and I'll show it in just a moment. But also I talked about these access levels, right? Physical and logical. These are what help make these test cases repeatable based on your approach. And these access levels, they start from the processing units down to your SoC system on a chip, or maybe your microcontroller, all the way up to your user interfaces, right? Whether that is anything from maybe a web perspective, and one of those big ones, right, are usually some input validation. You're usually testing an embedded web application, right? They're not a modern stack, so they're more susceptible to vulnerabilities from 10, 15 years ago. And that's just, that won't change until some of the semiconductor manufacturers, right, change some of that, how they code. And you might think, Rust and Go, but we'll get to some of those in a minute. So, again, we set out to sort of close that gap in the industry and help, some of that, getting going with testing sort of IoT and helping scope, your tests, right? And so we'll start with the IoT security testing framework, and this is the differentiator of the project compared to mobile and the web testing guide. And so as you see, we have an enclosure, we have an IoT device, we have the firmware, data exchange service, processing unit memory, and we have internal interfaces, right? Inter-process communication happening. We usually have a physical interface, then wireless, and some sort of user interface as well. You'll see in the legend here, is there physical connection, wireless connection, physical or wireless connection. And you have your IoT ecosystem. That's usually, again, your mobile and your web and your backend and your cloud, right? So, right, IoT is a system of systems, right? And so in this case, you're usually focused on, a smaller subset of that system. And again, we're focusing on the device in this case. So we built the scheme to get started with how am I going to tailor my test based off of, what components I have in scope. And so the other aspect, right, if I'm looking for a pen test on a product, right, you usually want different access to a device itself. Again, remember, if it's hung up on a wall, I can do certain things. If I have it in my hand, I can do certain things, right? So, with remote access, right, you can attack it, over the internet, without having to be, it's arbitrary distance. We have local access, which is directly accessible via LAN or WAN. Non-invasive access, you can't physically access the device internal elements, but you do have access to it. And then you have invasive access. Maybe you have a lab, right? And you can directly pop open the enclosure, access device internal elements, and maybe you want to grab the memory, or maybe you want to bypass sort of secure boot or that chain of trust. Those are really for again, the more resilient tests that you want to frame, right? And again, the remote access, right? Some of these could even be a goal from, PA1, which is physical access level 1, and then all the way over to maybe PA4, depending on, maybe you have one that, depending on, again, the scope of the test, right? And what you're looking to get out of it. And so this helps, again, sort of frame your scope, along with, again, your credential access. And we call this logical access levels for the time being. And I'll share that in a moment. This is all around okay, what sort of access do I have? Is it unauthorized access where any registered user can go ahead and test this device and this particular target? Do you have low privilege, right? Can any user with registered access, again, test, with standard privileges? Do you have high privilege access? Where you have restricted functionalities? And usually, right, if you have an IoT device, there's a manufacturer access. There's always something to debug. Even if they have secure boot, there's a secure way that you can unlock a device for you to get access to that. And then usually it'll give you, root privileges, or maybe you have source code access to that as well. And again, sometimes you might, make a goal of, hey, I have unauthorized access and I want to have manufacturing level access. How do I do that? What's the best way? What's the best approach? And what cases should I focus on? So I can really get the results that I'm looking for and the outcome. And so I mentioned logical access and authorization. We're in a peer review moment. And so one of the things that maybe caused a little bit of inertia is hey, there's a little bit of a learning curve for these access levels. And I heard some folks, at different events, maybe we should rename how logical access is labeled for folks, right? Because we're talking about authorization to the device and escalating that privilege over to manufacturing level access. Maybe that might be the best way, because if we're saying logical, it could be analytical, or maybe something that isn't as clear or concise at what we're looking for. And so, with our official release coming soon, that might be something to look out for. Would that make more sense? Just a quick poll? Yep. Okay. Awesome. All right, so we're going to go down to the test cases. So we talked about the physical access levels. What physical proximity do I have to a target? And then logical, or sort of your authorization level, right? And so once we have those squared away, we know what we have access to, right? We're going to want to tailor our test cases. This is really the meat and potatoes in terms of what exactly we're going to do, what the outcomes we're looking for, what problems we're trying to solve, or what problems we're trying to find. And so, we have eight different test cases, test case categories, right? Starting, again, I mentioned from the processing units over to the user interfaces and everything in between, right? We talked about memory, and there's firmware, and there's categories in between these, and we'll get to those as well. But generally, right, similar to just the nomenclature or taxonomy of the other testing guides, we'll start with the category or component here, and then sort of have the test cases afterwards. So And starting with IoT, you'll see like with web, I'll say WSTG, right, dash, whatever category it is. And so we talked about that device model scheme here, and we're sort of numbering them 1 through 8, from the processing unit down to the user interfaces, you can see to the bottom right. And so we'll tailor based off of, again, these different areas, these different components here. So processing unit is the component, right? So these first two, these components are particular to the IoT project. You won't see these in the mobile or web, and this is why sort of IoT is a little bit, I don't want to say special, but this is actually what helps us focus, right? And we also have a component specialization. I mentioned there are other sort of test cases in between, and with firmware, or maybe you may or may not know with firmware, they have firmware OTA systems or update systems, and there are flaws that happen. We have the opportunity to execute arbitrary code, as an example, or maybe do other, injection attacks or things you may not be allowed to, right? And firmware is just one example, and there's more, and I'll show just some of the opportunities to contribute in the future. So we have our components, component specialization. We have categories, and we have authorization, information gathering, maybe configurations, right? And then the test cases within them. So IoT, firmware, information gathering, 1, 2, and 3 are those test cases. And again, so these two top ones are the differentiators for this project. This is really what's going to help you sort of hone in and really get the results that you're looking for. So just an example of what a test case looks like. Again, if you're familiar with the testing guides, it may not look terribly different aside from the required access levels. And in this case, right, this is code or command injection with input validation. We have the required access levels up at the top. So PA4, we have invasive access. And depending on your scope for the logical aspect or your authorization, it could be unauthorized access all the way up to manufacturing level access. Maybe you might want to have both in any sort of pen test to get the results you're looking for. You may want a regular one that customers have. Then you maybe want a debug one that developers use and ensure that the controls for the production one, right, and doesn't have the developer sort of if there's debug code or debug access, right? So usually you want to have those two personas, or similar to web, right? You will have an admin level and maybe like a lower privilege level. In this case, we're talking about from the perspective of a manufacturer who has these two different accesses, right? Then we have the summary, test objectives, right? What's the outcome we're looking for? Remediation, and then some references. The remediations aren't prescriptive, similar to the other projects. It's really contextual to the device's environment usually, but we'll try our best to give you an idea of where to start. And so to make this, like interoperable, make it sort of like usable, we want to make sure that we have the formats available to folks, right? Whether you have a checklist, you want literally a checklist that we have, or you want a Markdown, you want to Excel, or you want to ingest it into your own tooling to help start some automation, right? Whatever it is you can automate, information gathering maybe, or maybe some of the other data exchange, right? And so having these different output formats for folks who are interested in testing your device, right? And then we'll have something simple as pass, fail, in this case, or not applicable for particular test cases. And this one is the data exchange services. And you'll notice some similarities in a moment in terms of some of the test cases with the different components. And that's because, right, that gives you that coverage, and that also gives you that assurance that you're not missing something that you should be testing. And that's also, right, with pen tests, you don't know what you're getting. You don't know, maybe they're just focusing, maybe you have a 2-week pen test, maybe 1.5 weeks they're focusing on just getting a root shell, and you forgot all these other different entry points because they just focused on this one aspect. This one critical could have some value, but at least for me, I want to know what the coverage is, what exactly that was tested, and how it can help us in the future and remediate those risks. So I'm going to go through a demo of selecting test cases, and maybe this will tie it all together with something that you might be familiar with. So we'll have a commercial security camera, right? Everyone's familiar with commercial security camera. You can go maybe at a parking lot or an airport. It's wall mounted, out of reach, right? Public place, usually connected to a video management system, through the network. And you have, your smart home devices, your cameras, be it your Nest or any other sort of consumer smart home, camera. It can be bought by anyone. Generally, right, it's installed in private homes, but also convenience first. Maybe security second. There aren't many standards in the consumer space that need to adhere to, different regulations. But generally, right, you'll find a lot more flaws in the consumer cameras, right, than, maybe the commercial cameras, but also just you'll have, the device in hand yourself, while one is wall mounted. And so you have a different approach to testing these cameras with how you're going to tailor your test cases. And so with the commercial camera, right, like it's wall mounted, so you don't have physical access to it. So that just automatically removes a lot of the cases themselves, right? You can't get access to the enclosure or the devices themselves, right? You got the processing unit, the memory, the firmware, internal interfaces, physical interfaces. We would say these are out of scope for what we're testing. There could be an argument for the firmware, maybe OTA system, that's available via network. But to generalize here, you'll notice that we have data exchange, because that might be in a category there. If there's insecure data, you might be able to unlock some other cases potentially. You have wireless interfaces, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, any other sort of protocols there. And user interfaces as well. How are you interacting with that device? So the physical access level, so it's PA1, remote access. And you'll have low privilege access, LA2. So you'll have an account, with standard privileges, as you log into, maybe this commercial, camera, and you'll be able to do some things and assess, based off that particular user. And again, maybe you might want to escalate that privilege up to a higher privilege or a manufacturing level, so L3, L4. So this really scopes, again, your target here and helps with that clarity. You can have that picture painted, for the recipients of the pen test or the assessment or whatever it may be. And in this case, we have the smart home device, this camera. You have full access to the device in hand, so which means the processing unit, right, the memory, firmware, everything's in scope. You'll have the ability to, drill down. You could even, decap if you want, and do some other things, and have some invasive access is really the point of this level here. So you also have a low privilege access, standard user, et cetera. But again, a little bit more clear in terms of what you can do and how you want to test them. And so we'll give an example in a moment, but would that make sense? And sort of like how would you approach the different types of targets, from a commercial to like a home in this case? Yeah. Okay. So we have these components, modular expansions. I mentioned, right, we have the firmware OTA system, as you'll see here, the firmware update mechanism. And you'll see in the bottom left what we have already available, and what's also planned, and maybe other ideas you may have, right, to help improve the test cases for these particular these component specializations, these protocols really. So we talked about firmware, and we have those already available in green, and then the ones that we don't have are in orange yellow. So you'll see, like for USB, right, the physical IoT physical, you'll have Ethernet there, anything that you can interact physically. You can also test. Again, there's software on the other side, there's software on the client side, which means there's susceptibility to vulnerabilities, right? Similarly, wireless, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, these are also opportunities. So if you are an expert or maybe just a novice in these areas and want to help, with different modules and help other folks as well, there's an opportunity to contribute. And there's other areas even lower than this if we're thinking about, IoT, when you think about bootloaders, maybe like a trusted anchor module or a sort of secure element, right? That's really the chain of trust. So there's opportunities to get even lower level if you work with hardware engineers or, those are really the high impactful sort of areas where you really want to hone in on was without, those sort of a secure bootloader architecture or trusted anchor module. Maybe those commercial cameras do have, maybe the consumers don't, right? And that's what gives you the opportunity to control a device. Again, without that chain of trust or that root of trust, there really isn't security for a device itself. Everything client side, right, can be bypassed. So something to keep in mind. But again, if you all have ideas to help contribute, we're all ears. We're open to them. So I mentioned there's some similarities, right, with some of the test cases, and to give you sort of a broader view of, what we have for, test cases across the different components. You'll see I put in a box here all the similarities, right? We have authorization, we have secrets, input validation across all these spaces. And for me, that gives me the confidence that, hey, we did test all of our interfaces with, for input validation, for injection attacks. And information gathering is also a similarity, a little bit of difference in the left side. But again, if you're maybe talking to, your customers and you want to build that trust with them and they want to learn, how you're approaching testing for your device as part of, your product development lifecycle, it's easy to point them to things that are public, reputable, and maybe, repeatable, right? That's the whole idea of this. And that gives you that assurance that these were performed against my device. And at that moment in time, right, unless you can repeat it, right, that I feel pretty good. And so you'll see in the component specializations highlighted in yellow, I mentioned. So those also have similar information gathering and secrets, right? You always have, there's always opportunity to put secrets somewhere. And usually developers may or may not know the best ways to store secrets, especially in IoT. Again, if you don't have a root of trust, secrets could be anywhere. You're not storing them securely. Maybe they don't have like isolation to be able to protect from them. And you'll see all the way in the processing unit as well, one sort of special case that's not in any of the other ones is side channel attacks. And those could be whether, from EMF, EMFI like signals or even just, some sort of glitching that you can do, for the electrical components that you can bypass maybe boot arguments or get into a sort of debug shell as well. Different aspects, right? There's depending on, the implementation, there's a lot of opportunities there. But the idea, right, is to show, the relation between, all these different areas and how it'll help, with building a trustworthy product. All right, so I'm going to jump over just to our roadmap and just share a little bit of the vision, because it's definitely, again, a project that we want to sustain and we want, everyone here to contribute or at least keep an eye. I mentioned we're in a peer review stage right now. Last month we opened up that peer review, and so again, looking for your specialization or your ability to maybe the content or improve it. If you would spend some time, right, we have our project up on GitHub, and again we have those different formats available to you if you're interested in trying them out internally, and even if you're working with consultants or something, hey, what are you using for your methodology and testing our particular product, right? I want to know exactly what's your approach. Maybe this testing guide might be an area to sort of help provide that awareness. And so similar to the mobile and web testing guides, right? We want them to be adopted by the industry, by standards. whether it be ATT FirstNet, so first responders, you have to get certified. Your product has to get certified. It has to go through a testing lab, has to go through an attestation. And there is one for IoT, and so we want this project to help with some of those certifications on the product side. But even for the mobile and web, Google has this 88 program for cloud application security testing. They use the web testing guide and ASVS, and mobile testing guide and MASVS, similar to CREST, BSI, over across the pond, and NIST as well. So we're also following suit with the other projects. Mentioned the ASVS project, or the verification projects. We have one for IoT in addition to that. So again, trying to round out and follow the other projects, and also not reinvent the wheel. Right? There's experts in web, experts in mobile, and so where appropriate, right, we want to make sure to leverage those that expertise from those groups. Those are really flagship projects, right? And so right now we're still in the incubator stage. So maybe one day we'll get to that flagship area, but there's a lot of support, right, from these different groups, from companies, from individuals, and people who who care deeply about them. Not to say that we don't, we definitely do, but to be able to sustain, right, open source projects, you need to have a lot of volunteers, but also core project members. So we're looking for core project members. If folks can have time to volunteer or want to learn, right? You don't have to be an expert in this space to be able to contribute. That's definitely not how I started. I started just to wrap my head around what is this IoT, and now we're releasing projects. So some takeaways, get involved, just that I was mentioning right now, learn by doing, improve the content quality, contribute to the community, and wrapping up with testing guides provide a basis for repeatability, transparency, assurance, and trust. And so if you want to get involved, here's our GitHub page. I've got email if you want to contact me directly. We also have an OWASP Slack, and that's the channel that we're in. And then we also just have our project page at the bottom if you're interested as well. So I'm available, as well as our project leader, Luca. And with that, thank you for your attention and your time. I can take some questions. I think we have some time. Thank you.
So general question on PUFs, physical unclonable functions. Are you seeing any movement there recently?
On PUFs? I'm not too familiar with PUFs. I've heard of them, but I'm not too familiar. Can you?
Yeah, so it's like a semiconductor entropy derived uniqueness of that physical device. So they derive this uniqueness that can't be clonable. Down to the semiconductor.
Semiconductor uniqueness that can't be clonable. You're right. I did hear of this standard.
They actually kind of try to pull it off the MCU chip.
Like identity, right? It's just identity for chips.
But it's based off of semiconductor physics characteristics that's unique to that one wafer.
Yeah.
So if you didn't hear so much about it, I'm not seeing a whole lot either. But
no, I've heard of the standard. I think that'll fit, at the lower levels of. Usually your identity and your root of trust, there usually is something there, whether it's a certificate that has your identity or that entropy that you're mentioning with PUF, right, is another, maybe a scheme. I think there's other, I think MUD is another one as well. But no, I think those could be areas, when we think about, how to test those and validate identity, at the lower level, whether it be bootloader or root of trust. I think there's opportunities to maybe have modules there. Again, I think those are our specialization modules, right? Those components that we can focus on, right? How do you manipulate identity for a device? Because at the end of the day, right, identity is everything. Whether it's IoT or enterprise, right? You get compromised and based off the access of that identity, what you can do with it. So, do we have people involved from semiconductor companies in the project? No, but I welcome anyone who works for semiconductors to help contribute. There's a fair amount, right? In the embedded space or more of the IoT space, it's a little bit different from what maybe they have with AMD and Intel with the larger bare metal, sort of architectures, right? I've reached out to a number of folks there over the years with the firmware security testing methodology. Folks from Intel, not many folks from AMD. Didn't get much luck. I think but they do contribute to like the MITRE CWE hardware, the top 25, if folks are familiar with that. So like I'll join those calls and try and help like socialize OWASP projects there. But I think they're not much involved in OWASP though. I think it's or not yet at least, but I'll keep trying. Yeah. Yes.
What are the most common operating system and software stacks you see in firmware today?
Yeah, the most common operating system and firmware stacks. I would go with Linux. A form of embedded Linux would probably be the most pervasive operating system platform out there. Whether it's vehicles that might run some of those, right? Like automotive grade Linux, or even just your own flavor. You can use Yocto as a build system that gives you that opportunity to build your own flavor. But there's also real-time operating systems and other bare metal platforms where sensors or maybe PLCs, programmable logic controllers, right, will communicate. They have basic, again, sort of logic there. But I would say most of like the feature-filled, devices of IoT that aren't sensors or PLCs or anything like that are probably Linux. And again, there's also like commercial real-time operating systems and such. But again, they have a different like kernel architecture, microkernels versus kind of like the monolith that Linux kernel has. So depending on the footprint and like maybe the funding or the dollar amount or maybe the energy, if you're out like in the farm or something, right? You don't want to use a lot of energy. You might want to use a real-time operating system because Linux is probably too intense for that. Just some examples there, but that's generally what similar to mobile devices, right? They have a derivative of Linux, and that's sort of like the commonality there. And also semiconductors, they build these support packages for Linux as well, and so it's usually, hey, I'm a developer, I know how to develop, and or I'm familiar with Linux kernel functions or something like that, and so they usually go with that option. Thank you. Yes.
So hey, thanks, Aaron. I'm Brian Reed, and I'm part of the mobile spec. So at noon, next door, I'm going to do the MESTG to go with the ISTG you just saw here. So if you're interested in IoT pen testing, odds are you're going to deal with mobile apps as well. So I'll give you the other half of the story at 12 o'clock.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Brian. Yes. So another session. What time is that?
12.
At 12. Perfect. So yeah, in about an hour. So I'll definitely be there. Thanks for that, Brian. Yes.
I don't know if we've done this in this space, but my curiosity is, anybody that does pen testing for IoT, if there's ever been any other factors, external factors, meaning like from a temperature standpoint, in which the silicon can be put into a state where something is modified the silicon to, I guess, manipulate it. So the reason I say this is doing testing at AMD. It took that long to go that way. We had something called four corners testing where we were modifying the speed of the processor, higher speeds, lower speeds, but then in the chamber where it was hot and cold. And if you were looking at it from the failure perspective, what my thought is, could we get into a state where something has been being manipulated and then, now again, going to a whole level, but
So the question is generally about like temperature testing and environment testing for devices in a chamber, whether it's hot and cold. It's not in the project, but there are, like, you can slow down clocks by and you can also bypass certain logic, with those certain test cases. So I think, Shannon was mentioning from AMD, they used to have these four corners testing, and this is what they used to do, maybe for quality or those areas. But for security and those side channel attacks, those are definitely areas, right, that can give you, can divulge secrets and divulge identities and give you the availability or the opportunity to manipulate, that logic, or even bypass it completely because it's not meant to be in that. So those are really resilient devices that should go through those. But I think it's a good call out that an opportunity. We do have that side channel. Maybe there's an area there. If folks do that, could be able to contribute. All right, take you back there.
Could you talk a little bit about your tool chain? Obviously, some of the testing tool chain would be the same if you do it, mobile or web. But are there any things you're using or things you're seeing deployed that you think are worth calling out? Or?
Yeah, no, that's a good question around like what's my tool chain when I'm you're attacking IoT and they're similar than maybe others depending right on your access. That remote access, maybe you're using a similar a mass scan or a Nmap or a variant of that, right? But if we're talking about firmware, the firmware security testing methodology, there's a lot going on with firmware depending on depending on the platform. Is it ARM64? Is it MIPS? And you'll have ways to emulate that piece of firmware to then perform dynamic testing, as an example, right? When the device is running. Again, if it doesn't have secure boot, you can probably emulate that thing, that particular firmware. And even just taking that apart, right? One that's been around forever that people might be familiar with, right, is BinWalk by Refirm Labs. That's a good one. But there's whole platforms and free platforms now. There's firmware analysis comparison toolkit from a university out in Germany that has a whole suite. It even checks for what flags binaries are compiled with. Does it have NX bits? Does it have ASLR? So I would start with firmware analysis comparison toolkit for firmware, and everything else might be a little bit standard, unless you're getting down to the hardware level, right, where you're touching the debug points for JTAG or UART, if you've ever heard of those before. Those are really what gets you access to like the memory for JTAG, and UART. Usually it's for debugging in some way. And if there's a shell on the other end, right, what can I do with that shell, or how can I interrupt or bypass or manipulate that communication? And they have particular like connectors for UART and JTAG. JTAGulator is one common one to use to maybe get access or even figure out how to attach to JTAG for that particular device, because they're not all the same depending on the platform itself. So there's some variants, but that's part of maybe the curve, right, for IoT, is that the hardware aspect, right, and that's what I was maybe starting with, like the application layer and moving way down, because you'll end up with a whole lot of different attachment connectors and adapters on the hardware side. But the firmware, like I said, if you pull the firmware, you might get more bang for your buck, by looking for configuration issues, secrets, finding a way to get to the cloud. It's usually a connected device, right? So how do you pivot to the cloud and get access there? So we do note some tools and some references in the project, but yeah, it's a changing landscape. It's definitely grown though in the last 10 years for sure. A lot more visibility there, and that's what we're trying to do as well. Happy to elaborate more afterwards. I'll take one more question. Yes.
Exactly, this project is trying to expand as like a module to even provide a testing guide with Bluetooth or Wi-Fi stuff you already mentioned.
Yeah.
So how do you think about some kind of wide field gears and those kind of Bluetooth? Is because of no research more, or not many contributors, or not many vulnerability, or not many expertise for this area? How do you think about this?
Okay, yeah, the questions around kind of like the component specialization modules and developing one for Bluetooth, and maybe why we don't have one with the testing guide right now. Is that correct? It's just because we're putting out a baseline, version of the testing guide. We can't put everything in, for the initial release, and I think this is one just to show the opportunities that, if you work with devices that have Bluetooth, whatever it may be, whatever version, and you want to help, the project in contributing, building that, then that's where, we'd like your help. So not necessarily expertise, but we definitely, want folks who, work in that space, maybe more than we do, right, to be able to help sort of round out the edges there. So Bluetooth is one of those, and Wi-Fi and different variants of Wi-Fi. We have 6E now, 7 coming out next year, right? And then what can we do with that, and what sort of like access can we get from them, depending on whatever your goal is. So yeah, if you're working with Bluetooth, we can chat later. Sounds good.
And wireless mesh.
Wireless mesh, yeah, with Wi-Fi. Yep, exactly. Yeah. yeah, there's also other protocols, even, LoPan and all these other ones. So, all right, folks, going to go ahead and wrap up. I'll be around to chat if folks have any other questions. Thank you again. I appreciate it.